How's it going, guys? We're going to cover microbiology 2 right now, and we'll do the first week of class. So we're starting off just describing what parasitology is, and it's a branch of microbiology that studies parasitism and parasitic organisms, which are eukaryotic cells. We studied prokaryotic cells in Micro 1, so we're moving on to the nitty-gritty. So why is this important to us? Because the most prevalent tropical diseases, 7 out of 8 of them are parasitic in nature. So once you get out of the United States, it really becomes a health concern. Most harmful infective diseases afflicting humans are parasites. It's 5 out of 6 of the harmful diseases, infective diseases, are parasitic. So it's kind of it becomes important. So there's some terms that we need to know for the first week that are going to carry through for the rest of the quarter. So we'll start going through and discussing them. The first one you need to know is infection. Infection is an invasion by pathogenic parasites that can cause a reaction. Now this is different than a disease, because a disease is actual damage of host tissues that causes dysfunction. So disease will cause dysfunction, whereas infection will just cause a reaction. That's the biggest difference between the two. You have the term vector, and vector is an organism that transports pathogens from infected to non-infected host. So it goes from an infected host to a non-infected host. You have a final host, or a definitive host, and that's an organism in which sexual reproduction occurs. So you have a final host and then you have an intermediate host. This is what distinguishes the two different hosts. And intermediate is where asexual reproduction occurs. She described in class of a mosquito. Mosquito is actually, this is kind of the rare one, because most intermediate hosts are the vector. So the mosquito you would think the mosquito would be the intermediate host, but it's not in this case, because the bacteria, or the parasite involved here, it reproduces sexually inside of the mosquito's stomach. And so because it reproduces sexually, it's a final host, and when it transmits it into a human or another host, it becomes intermediate, because it's an intermediate host, because that's where asexual reproduction occurs. So when we're talking about malaria, and it's inside the human, that we are the intermediate host because it reproduces asexually. So that's the only really confusing thing that we dealt with at all this first week. There's also what's known as a reservoir host, and this is the host that serves as a source of infection. And one more term we covered was infestation, and you can think of that like fleas or ticks. It's a microorganism that lives on the surface of the host, so it doesn't actually go inside the host. The rest of the time we jumped into protozoa, but before we go into that, we can talk a little bit about the immune responses and parasites. She kind of briefly went over this. There's 10 key points, so I'll just breeze through them real quick. You have they have a rapid rate of reproduction. So when a parasite gets inside your system, it reproduces very quickly, which makes it difficult for your body to fight it off. All these are reasons of why it can be difficult to fight off a parasitic infection. The large size, so you think of something like a tapeworm, it gets very, very large, and your body just can't fend something off that gets beyond a certain size. You just don't have the ability to, so you kind of just deal with it. A lot of parasites will produce a slime layer or a capsule, which, if you remember from Micro 1, makes it difficult to fight that off. You can't phagocytize those parasites. They have complex life cycles, which means they change. So they start out as a larva, and then when they go to adult, they actually change form. So if your body doesn't kill it as a larva and then it changes, you're now making it more difficult for your body to attack that. They mask their surface antigens with a host cell marker. She talked about HLA, which is human leukocyte antigen. Their byproducts can prevent the function of antibodies, macrophages, and lymphocytes, and they can cause immunosuppression and allergic reactions. So when you have you also can produce high levels of IgE antibodies. For example, she talks about the helminth worm. They can induce T-cell delayed hypersensitivity responses, which is also a reaction that can bother us. And the other ones aren't so important. I'll kind of just move along here. Protozoa. So we're discussing protozoa for the next few weeks in class, and right now we're just going into the classification of a few of them that we consider important in the medical world. So we'll talk about their style of movement, mode of reproduction, and the stages of their life cycle. So the first one we talk about is called Sarcodina, which is a type of amoeba. So Sarcodina, it has pseudopodia, which is like a false foot, and that's how it moves. That's its means of transportation. Some species may have a flagella during their reproductive stages, like a tadpole, but these typically are non-infectious. They reproduce asexually, and they will usually form a cyst. So then you have Mastigophora, which is a flagellata. It moves by a flagella, so because it's in the category of flagellata, it moves with a flagella, and it reproduces both sexually and asexually. Most species form cysts and are free-living, but some are also parasites and human pathogens. We have Ciliophora, also aka ciliata, and they move using cilia. So this is a major difference from the amoeba species, and they reproduce asexually. So that's different than the Sarcodina or the Mastigophora. All of them so far have reproduced asexually. Mastigophora is the only one that also produced sexually. So we are on to Ciliophora is also free. They're free living, and one of these pathogens, known as Balantidium coli, lives in animal intestines and may infect humans. Most important one we talked about was Sporozoa, and its movement was not prominent characteristic, or movement's not prominent characteristic in most of its cells, so it just kind of sits there. It doesn't really do anything. Sometimes you'll have a pseudopod or flagella, but not for the most part. They reproduce asexually and sexually, and it's a complex method, is what makes it a little bit more unique than the others. And the entire group of sporozoas are all parasitic in nature. And one of the examples of the sporozoa that we discussed in class was Plasmodium, which is the parasite that causes infection, or it causes malaria. It causes malaria. And there's 100 to 300 million cases a year of malaria, so it's a pretty big deal. But that's pretty much where we left off on week 1. So we're good.